Greetings, friends! Juan here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of September 2nd through September 8th of 2024. And this week we got some updates, so let's get into them. And so this week, it's basically the battle for flanking maneuvers. So, um, almost every around the front, each side is trying to outflank certain defensive positions of their opponent, and they're coming in areas that were kind of been in a slowdown in these past few weeks, but they have been reignited, and places that we've been focusing on for the last 2 months or so have now quieted down a little bit. Um, and we're actually going to start this week not in the Ugeldar direction, because the Russians have basically activated the Ugeldar offensive operation. So they started this after, we talked about this last week, after the fall of Konstantinovka and the capture of everything along the highway. So Ugeldar is officially, for the most part, cut off from the eastern side. And once this happened, we saw a huge bombardment of Ukrainian positions in Ugeldar itself. We saw a huge artillery barrage on it. We also saw the Russians start attacking, basically trying to encircle Ugeldar. So, they had to pull up the front because in order to assault Ugeldar, they have to basically cut off all network nodes of support for it, because that is how the Russians failed to take Ugeldar last time. They attacked it directly. They managed. They were able to reach this area right here, these dachas. But then because the Ukrainians had a stable supply through the highway and they had positions in this mine, they were able to counterattack and attack the Russians in their flanks. And so the Russians basically said we need to basically clear the fields before or the flanks before we could attack Ugeldar. So the battle for Ugeldar or at least the Ugeldar campaign, is ongoing. So one of the biggest things is that the Russians have activated on the western direction. So this section, they never really moved in this direction. It was pretty quiet. A lot of the action was on this side. We saw the fall of Konstantinovka. We saw, the capture of the main fortifications along the highway. But the Russians actually activated on this area and managed to capture a big chunk of land here. One of the biggest things they captured was the village of Pershishivka right here. And right now it seems like the Russians are also pushing towards the small village of Zolta Noniva. There's no confirmation that they've captured it, but it looks like they are moving along this highway and along this river and reaching it. And probably, most likely, that the Russians might capture this within a week or two. And it seems like what they're trying to do is basically, flatten the front line with their positions in Pavlovka. And then what a lot of sources are saying is that they're going to try to attack north along these two roads, try to start battling for Shartarska and Novoborovka here. And because if they could start battling for these two villages, then, then this starts, cutting off, threatens the forces in Ugeldar from retreating to the south. And so, encircling Ugeldar from the east is very important, because this is where they were able to knock the Russians out last time, but it also is important for the Russians to improve their positions in the western part. So the Russians will probably take Zolta Noniva and start pushing upwards a little bit and try to start moving towards these two villages right here. But right now, so far for this week, they captured the village of Pershishivka and kind of the fields between Novomayorska and that village. So this area right here was captured by the Russians as well. And what will be good about taking Zolta Niva is that the Russians will also be able to kind of have a good defense with Novodonetska. And so they'll have something like this and capture these fields as well. So, the Ukrainians will have to basically move through from Velika Novosolovka across a bunch of fields if they want to start attacking the flanks here. But again, there's a lot of space between the main Ukrainian positions in here and where the Russians will be holding off them as they try to encircle Ugeldar. So very good progress for the Russians, and they basically restarted the offensive operations to the west, but they also have continued their offensive operations in the east here. We got more confirmation that basically the Russians have cleared up everything here. They basically cleared out the northern dachas and cleared out everything along this highway to the north of Konstantinovka. So now they have a solid front line between Konstantinovka and Pobeba. We also saw that the clashes for this mine are still ongoing. The Ukrainians are still in control of the main Terracon, so they still have the height advantage. However, the Russians are still in this, like, kind of the warehouses. So we saw that the Russians are still battling for these warehouses, and if the Ukrainians can't push them out of there, then the Russians will probably be able to storm this Terracon very soon. Um, Also, the battle for Verdana is starting. The Russians have basically crossed the highway and have not just stopped there. A lot of sources are saying that the Russians are. I don't think they've entered Verdana just yet, but they have taken these tree lines right in front of Verdana, and some sources are saying they also have captured this area right here of Verdana. So it looks like the Russians actually. Some sources are saying the Russians have entered these dachas right here. So, the Russians are active in this area, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold them off on these more warehouses right here. But it seems like the Russians will probably storm Verdana very soon and try to at least capture this area, and then the Ukrainians will have to retreat to the other coal mine, this area right here. But this is an industrial zone, so this could be very easily defended, but it's very small, and, it's very easy that the Russians could try to encircle it. But right now, the focus is on Verdana. They are reaching it, but the battle for the village itself has not commenced yet. So, as you can see, the goal is to take Verdana, to take this coal mine, to take Zolova, Zolta, Noniva, and move upwards. And then, from there, the front line will kind of go something like this. And then, let's see, something like this. And let's say something like this here. And so, if we see something like this, we can start seeing Ugeldar being encircled. So then, if the Russians want to push, this way or towards Botokolonivka, so let's say the Russians push north from Perchishivka and take this village right here, then they could start linking up from Verdana towards this main hub right here, because this will be the next hub the Russians will have to take after the fall of Ugeldar. And so if they start clashing for the town of Botokolonivka here, then, the Ugeldar will fall by necessity. And looks like maybe the main goal of the Russians is to then have the front line go something like this. So kind of pull the front upwards. And again, this is all because they want to flatten the front line with what's happening in the Pokrovsk direction. And so we're going to talk about, why they activated the Ugeldar front in a moment here. Let's continue talking about kind of the general South Donetsk direction, so everything generally in this area right here. So this is the South Donetsk direction, so there's a lot of more interesting update that's happening there. So another interesting thing that's happening in the southern direction of Donetsk is the full capture of Krasnogorivka. Now, some sources are saying that the only thing left of Krasnogorivka, for some reason my computer decided to take a giant shit. Well, anyway, so the main thing for what's happening in Krasnogorivka is that the Russians have captured these full dachas to the north here, and they managed to push the front line towards this kind of ravine right here, because we saw the Ukrainians attacking the Russians in this direction. So the only thing that the Ukrainians have left of Krasnogorivka is these farms right here. So these are the last buildings left of Krasnogorivka. But for all intents and purposes, the battle, Krasnogorivka has completely fallen to the Russians, and this was helped because the Ukrainians are retreating from what they call the Nevesky pocket. So ever since the Russians broke through towards Ukrainsk and this area, generally right here, and started battling for Selidovo, the Ukrainians that were in this pocket realized, oh shit, we're going to be cut off, very, soon. And so we need to start pulling back. And so that is what the Ukrainians are doing. So it looks like they retreated from the Krasnogorivka and retreated back towards Gernik, Zernona, and tried to basically hold the Russians back in this area. And it looks like they kind of retreated to the Vochka River defenses here. And so this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold off the Russians from reaching Kurakova. So yeah, a big, they have fully captured Krasnogorivka, and one of the biggest, kind of more symbolic things as well. So one thing also about the Nevesky pocket is that it's slowly being cut into pieces. So Nevesky has been fully recaptured by the Russians. So everything that was here was captured by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are slowly kind of pulling back from these fields here and are retreating towards this area in the Vuchka River. So everything to the east of this red line will probably be captured by the Russians. One thing that's symbolic is that the last 2014 defense lines of Ukrainians, which were here, were captured by the Russians. So basically, all along the entire front, everything that used to be part of the pre-war front line has been captured. Now, it's a bit symbolic. It doesn't really, this was the last part. It doesn't. It fell because the Ukrainians are retreating. But it is a bit symbolic that the last 2014 defenses has been taken. So that is happening in the South Donetsk direction. Krasnogorivka has been completely captured. Novesky has been captured, and these fields between like Karlovka and Krasnogorivka are going to be cleared up, and the battle for Ukrainsk, Gernik, and all these villages that are along the Vochka River on the way to Karakova will be the new areas of the battlefield. So that's the South Donetsk direction in Ugeldar. Now let's go back to our old friend, where the main action has been happening for the last 2-3 months. Well, basically for this entire year. After they captured Avdiivka and as they moved along the rail line and try to capture this area, but this accelerated intensely in the last month or so. However, there's been a slowdown, and the reason for that is because the Ukrainians have sent reserves back here, and so the Ukrainians were able to slow down the Russian advances. So now it looks like the Russians are now trying to regroup, solidify their gains here, and then continue the offensive operation. The biggest thing here, if we talk about the Pokrovsk direction here, is that there's been no changes on the Gorivka, Novy Gorivka area on the way to Pokrovsk itself. And one thing I want to say is that there's been very little geolocated, a lot of these gains were done by mappers. We have very little geolocated footage. We do have some geolocated footage. So for example, we saw that the Ukrainians were attacking Russian positions in this Terrakhan. And we saw that we actually finally got geolocated footage of the Russians being, I think, attacked somewhere here. So it looks like the center of Gorivka has fallen. However, there's probably some areas here that are not fully secured. The biggest thing probably is Mykolaievka. I think this is more in the gray zone, probably. I don't think this village is probably under Russian control, because the Ukrainians, as I mentioned last week, they have a bunch of trenches on the way to Minigrad and Pokrovsk, in these fields here. And the Ukrainians are falling back here, but, the Russians are trying to basically use Novy Gorivka as the new supply hub and to kind of bloom from it. And if I had to guess where the front line actually is, so Gorivka is kind of split in half by the river. I think the front line probably does go along the river, and that this part of Gorivka on the other side is probably still in the gray zone. Considering that considering that the Russians are in control of this Terrakhan and in this northern place right here, I think it's pretty safe to say that Kurtyar and Krasnoyar are probably under Russian control. So if I had to get a bit of a more clear picture here, is that the front line probably goes something like this, most likely. And these fields right here are under Ukrainian control. So it looks like right now the Russians are trying to turn Novy Gorivka and Gorivka as supply bases on their way to Pokrovsk, but there's been no real changes. But one reason why I want to clarify why the front line we see here might not be the front lines, because a lot of these changes was because of map changes and people say so, but not geolocated footage. And so sometimes that might not be the best. Just map sayers might be overly optimistic, overly pessimistic. Not to say that they're never reliable. It's just that they're not as reliable as geolocated footage. The reason why I also clarify that is because of the situation in Selidova, where this is where before we saw a lot of people were saying that the Russians captured this giant part of Selidova right here. But this was say-so. We never actually got any geolocated footage, and we finally got geolocated footage of the Ukrainians attacking Russian positions in this bridge right here, this bridge right here. What this does show is that the Russians are... So there is the, Mikhailovka right here, and then there's Selidova itself right here. So technically, so we don't have any geolocated footage of the Russians being in this second Terracon. So this map says it's still under control, so we'll have to follow to see if this is under control. We do know that this first Terracon is under Russian control, and we do know that most of this town of Mikhailovka is under Russian control. However, this is basically the same Selidova. So we could basically say that the Russians are on the eastern part of Selidova, but they were pushed. A lot of people say they were pushed out of the center of Selidova, but I think it was more like map changes. Like, people kind of got overly optimistic and were showing things that weren't actually there. So maybe there was like sabotage and reconnaissance groups here, but once the Ukrainians sent reinforcements to Selidova by the dozen, they sent a bunch of troops here. The recon units had to basically fall back, And what happened in Novigorivka was probably like a bunch of recon units came in and found little resistance, and the Russian troops were able to come in very easily. And so they were probably trying to do the same thing in Selidova, try to move in, see if there's any resistance, and have the main Russian force come in later. But they encountered resistance, and they had to fall back to more secure positions in the eastern part of Selidova. The Russian positions are a lot better if this second Terracon is also under their control, because then this gives them the high ground advantage, and the Russians will definitely be able to slowly but surely move the front line up into the high-rise buildings in the center, which is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold up. So again, there was a lot of rapid gains in this Pokrovsk direction that, for the first time in this war since like the beginning of this war, we were kind of overly optimistic in terms of, well, we don't actually, it's not clear cut, because before it was like it would take days, weeks to battle over one village, and we know for a fact since it was such a slow pace, we were able to follow it very methodically and very slowly. But since this was pretty rapid in the terms of the pace of this war, there might have been some little changes that the maps were a bit overly dramatizing it. So the Russian positions here are still very very good. It wasn't like a lot of this was fake. It was just there should be some clarification. So the Russians are on the eastern part of Selidov, but not battling for the center, and they are still they are still trying to secure themselves along they have captured most of Gordievka, like 90% of it, and all of Novogorivka, but they still need to make these like their new bases of operation, which takes a lot of refitting and such. One of the most interesting parts is here. Now, this is where I talked about how the Ugeldar operation connects with the Pokrovsk direction, because let's say the Russians do their Ugeldar offensive and something like this happens, right? Then the Russians will continue pushing, and they're going to go towards the village of Uspenska here and keep pushing towards this area right here. Try to basically bring the South Donetsk front line up here, and if they could do that, then as they pressure from the south, they could then they're also pressuring from the north here, because one of the biggest things about this is that this is a bit of a salient, and they basically want to kind of flatten the front line a little bit. So they kind of want the front line to go something like this. They want to pull, and then as you can see here, once they reach, right now, then you can see that then this becomes a more continuous front line, and the threat to the flanks is very much reduced. And so it looks like instead of going for Pokrovsk itself, because if, say, this doesn't happen, let's say they just attacked Pokrovsk and Leningrad directly, and they're trying to encircle it. So let's say then let's say the front line is something like this, right? Well then, this just makes it more of a salient. There's more areas, to get attacked from. And so, you might as while Pokrovsk is a big supply base, the Russians need to secure their flanks before they continue pushing towards it. They made a lot of rapid advances, but those rapid advances made this a bit of a big salient, and they want to basically reduce that. And so that's why I think the Ugeldar operation started off, and this is why I think a lot of the Russian focus has been on Selidova and Ukrainsk rather than on Pokrovsk, which is what we expected from before. Speaking of this, is that the Russians have started the battle for Ukrainsk here. What we can see here, so one of the biggest things is there's been some small gains, but the Russians are basically trying to encircle Ukrainsk. This is another place where the Russians are trying to do their encirclement here. Alrighty, so what's fun about Ukrainska is that the Russians are trying to slowly encircle it. This is another, encirclement attempt um, by the Russians, and just as in Chasov Yar, just as in Ugeldar. So one thing is that the Russians have captured the village of Listovka, which is a village right on the eastern outskirts of Ukrainska, and they have also captured the fields that are below the village of Dolinovka in this area right here. And they are now attacking and have captured the dachas to the south of Ukrainska here, and are now battling for the first high-rise buildings in this area right here. And so, along with this, the Russians are trying to move to the south of Selidova. A lot of sources show that the Russians have taken some of these fields to the north of Ukrainska, and it looks like the Russians will probably try to also enter from the north here and capture kind of these dachas right here, and try to basically put the squeeze on Ukrainska from many sides. And so we shall see how long the Ukrainians could hold off in Ukrainsk. But so the battle for this town has started. The Russians are in this town, and this is another place that needs to be captured. And the capture of Ukrainians could be very important, because if they capture it, then they could start moving to the village of Tesnudna here, and they could then move towards this rail line. And if they could reach this rail line, then just because, and while Selidova might not fall, so not only will they be able to start attacking Selidova from the south here, they'll be able to move along this rail line and reach the Vochka River Reservoir right here. And then they could cut off the Ukrainians guarding Gernik and all these villages and areas right here. And so the capture of Ukrainska would allow the front line to go something like this. And this will put, then there'll be only like one road for the Ukrainians to retreat from. And so they could bypass Selidova per se, and basically then use this rail line as to start cutting off and linking up the Ugeldar and Pokrovsk directions here. So the battle for Ukrainsk is beginning. And we shall see if the Russians make any more gains in Ukrainsk in the coming weeks. As we're in this direction, let's talk about some small gains happening in the Zaporozhye and Kherson directions. In the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians have flattened the front line in Robotina. Basically, the Russians have recaptured everything in the Robotina sector. This was basically what the front line was kind of like before the 2023 offensive. So basically, everything in the 2023 offensive was rolled back. So the Russians managed to flatten the front line along this tree line here, and basically cleared up the fields that were here. And I think the Russians are going to stop now. Obviously the Russians won't continue attacking towards Orekov. We might see a bit more movement here. Maybe the Russians want to take, these tree lines here, and maybe this tree line, and maybe move the front line more higher upward, and then not have, basically prevent the Ukrainians from pushing the dragging troops away from Zaporozhye to other directions. So they might continue pushing in Robotina to continue kind of maybe capturing more tree lines in this area right here, just to put the Ukrainians on their toes, and not prevent the Ukrainians from taking reserves from Zaporozhye and moving them towards other areas. So that's Robotina. The Russians have basically recaptured this village and flattened the front line, and are now in a very good position to defend it. In the Kherson direction, the Russians are recapturing the Dnieper Islands. We got some footage showing that the Russians have captured this island right here, and have entered this island right here. And so these like western islands here. And it seems like the purpose of this is that the Russians basically want to take as much want to basically take these islands, and not because they want to make another offensive on the Dnieper, on the other side of the Dnieper, but basically have these as outposts, so that if the Ukrainians want to gather troops in Kherson and attack across the Dnieper River again, they'll have to go through these islands, and it'll take a few weeks or months to clear them out before they could make another bridgehead. So the Russians are basically trying to put some positions between the main Russian positions on the other side of the Dnieper River and and these islands, so that just kind of expanding the gray, like kind of the defense zone, so that it's a lot harder for the Ukrainians to try to do another cross-border raid like they did in, or cross-border or cross-river invasion like they did in Krinky. Alrighty, let's now go to the Tourette's direction, and this is another area where we have to, we talk about how map changes might not be as accurate as we thought. This is happening a little bit in Touretsk. One of the biggest things is that the city of the town of New York has not completely fallen. We we thought the whole New York was fallen, but there was a bunch of counterattacks today, and that showed that the Ukrainians are still basically holding off in this factory right here. So the factory is still under Ukrainian control. I was kind of surprised that they were able to give up the factory without a fight, but it looks like it's now confirmed that the Russians are in control of this factory. Or no, the Ukrainians are in control of this factory. And it looked like the Ukrainians did a counterattack from Napolitevka here and managed to capture this area right here. And maybe they unblocked, because it looks like the Ukrainians were surrounded here for a few weeks. And what's interesting about it is that no one really talked about it. There was no really big news about the Ukrainians being encircled in New York from both the Russians or the Ukrainian side. That's why I thought it was fake, because no one was talking about it. But apparently they were there. Looks like there was a counterattack. And it looks like the Ukrainians basically were able to pull the forces away from here and save the forces that were surrounded. But the Russians did a counterattack and recaptured basically the southern part of Napolitevka here. And it looks like the Ukrainians are back being encircled in this factory. But we don't have any geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flag here. So I think if they do capture this factory, there will be a raising of the Russian flag, but we don't see that yet because there's still a lot more to do. So New York technically is not completely fallen, but the Ukrainians in this factory are in a very precarious situation. Like it's a hell of a hard time to supply them. It's a hell of a thing to continue giving them equipment and things like that. So I think the Ukrainians are trying to hold this factory because it's a very strong defensive position. But like when you're surrounded like this, it's a very all it is just I think they're just trying to hold there to the last man, so that the Russians can't solidify themselves in New York and continue pushing along this rail line and start battling for Petrivka and Shrotobolivka here, and start encircling Touretsk from the west here, just as they're doing from the north here. And so it looks like they're just kind of doing this as a roadblock to help hold off the Russian push in Touretsk itself. So it looks like, though, the Russians have captured the southern part of Napolitevka here, and the Ukrainians in the factory are still battling it out. So we shall see if the Russians are able to clear this in the next few weeks or so. However, where the Russians have made some advances and based on geolocated footage is in the center part of Touretsk. And so one of the biggest gains is that the Russians have completely captured the Touretsk the Touretsk prison. This is a prison, I believe. And we got some geolocated footage of the Russians being shelled in this area. And so we saw that the Russians have captured this this prison. And we also saw, I think I talked about this last week, that the Russians have cleared the fields between the Terrakans and in front of these two areas, this area right here. I don't know if that happened last week or this week, but if this is the true, then the Russians, some sources are saying that the Russians are storming or have already captured this small Terrakan right here. And so these were like the two main defenses, the prison and the Terrakan. And if it's true, so we know for sure that this prison was taken, and if this Terrakan is also taken, then the Russians will have another defense line to hold themselves to, and then they could probably push towards this area right here. And I think the Russians will focus on the southern portion as well, because the Ukrainians have a strong defense in the center of Touretsk with these high-rise buildings, and already the Russians already have positions in the southern part of this area. And so the Russians will probably try to clear these forests and enter, and try to capture, the southern part, at least maybe most of it, maybe like this area right here. And the Ukrainians will have to fall back to the Terrakans and the high-rise building areas right here. And from that point, the Russians will probably start trying to outflank it from the north here. So the Russians are slowly but surely pushing into Touretsk itself. I think the Russians are still battling. I don't know if these high-rise building areas are completely controlled by the Russians or only like 80 or 90%. But if so, the Ukrainians are trying to hold this off as much as possible so that they don't have to retreat back towards more reliable defenses. They're trying to prevent the Russians from fully securing themselves here. But it looks like the Russians have mostly captured this high-rise building district right here as well. We also have shieldcade footage of the Russians in capturing more of Druzhba, but most of the, like in this area. But yeah, most of this village has been captured by the Russians already, and so yeah, Druzhba has been taken. I talked about this last week, and now it looks like the Russians will use this rail line to reach Dacha and try to maybe start battling for Krimsky here and start outflanking Touretsk from the north here. So Touretsk, there's a lot of again, they're trying to encircle Touretsk like in all the other areas. And they're slowly but surely pushing into the city proper. But New York is still being fought over. Touretsk is the center. You know, the Ukrainians are trying to battle the Russians in the north, in the south. So there's a lot of work to do for the Russians if they want to take Touretsk. In the Chasov Yar direction, we actually have a lot of, not a lot, but like a lot of good updates for the Russians. One of the biggest changes was that the Russians have broken through in the Klishevka area and have managed to secure themselves along the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal in this area, and basically have captured these fields here. It looks like the Russians have completely captured the Klishevka hill, so which is the most important part of Klishevka, and because of this, it looks like basically almost all the gains of the Ukrainian 2023 offensive in Bakhmut have been reversed. And the only thing they have left is this area right here. But from the looks of it, the Russians will probably move along the canal and clear up these fields right here and fully secure themselves along the canal here. And then after they do that, the Russians will then try to clear these forest area right here and have the front line move along the canal. So since they broke through here and have managed to reach the canal here, the Russians will be able to kind of pincer in the fields here, from here and then from here. Since this was a center position, they're able to do this. The Russians are obviously in the north here already, so they're able to push from here and then from here. So because they're able to pincer, they'll probably be able to flatten the front line along the canal in the next month or so. Anyway, so this is a very good situation for the Russians. Again, because once they're on the canal here, they're able to they can start doing offensive operations to start cutting off Chasov Yar from the south, just as they were trying to do it from the north. But even if they don't, then this gives them a very strong position to guard from Ukrainian attacks in the south at the very least. And yeah, so we shall see if the Russians, how long it will take the Russians to clear these fields. It'll probably take, I could probably see by the end of September the Russians having the new front line be along the canal. And yeah, so yeah, a very big gain for the Russians reaching this area because this gives them the center position to start encircling the Ukrainians here. Another thing is the Russians have, we talked about how the Russians have completely captured Kalinova a few weeks ago. The Russians have made another bridgehead. So they have a bridgehead here in Chasov Yar where, they have a small positions in this Novi district. This is the Novi district right here, which is in front of the main center of Chasov Yar right here, which has a factory and some high-rise buildings. So this is a very strong fortification. But the Russians want to have a small position here so that, when they start encircling Chasov Yar from the south and north, they're able to attack it directly when need be, and they don't have to cross the canal, which is a major defense point for both sides. But what happened in the north is the Russians have made another bridgehead here. The Russians have captured Kalinova captured these buildings right here, which are part of Kalinova itself. And so they've made another small bridgehead to the north here. And once, they're probably going to try to do the same thing in the south here once they capture the canal. The Russians might want to maybe capture this quarry right here. Maybe have this be something like this. Maybe the Russians will, try to take this forest right here. Try to make some sort of small bridgehead on the other side of the canal in the south. Because then, the Russians could start, if they do, they could start advancing towards Spuchki here. this village right here to the south of Chasov Yar. From the north here, as we saw last week, the Russians are trying to storm Gridivka. The Russians are on the outskirts of the town. They have captured this in the last 2 weeks or so, this tree line. And it seems like what the Russians want to do is capture Gridivka, reach the canal here, and then try to capture this quarry to the north of Chasov Yar. So as you can see, the main defenses are in this quarry here and Stupshka. And so if the Russians are able to take these two defenses, then they could start putting the squeeze on Chasov Yar from two sides and force the Ukrainians to give up the city. So a lot of gains for the Russians in Chasov Yar, at least on the flanks. Again, it's a battle for encirclements. And the Russians are slowly but surely making small gains in the Chasov Yar direction. In the Seversk direction, there's been some changes. The Russians have some mappers have shown that the Russians have captured the southern part of the village of Pernishnia here. So they have basically captured to the eastern side of the Bakhmutka River. They managed to capture this area right here. And this is a good gain for the Russians. It looks like the Russians would probably try to use this rail line just as they were using the rail line right here to advance. The Russians will probably use this rail line to continue advancing north and take all of Pernishnia here and use the Bakhmutka River as like the defense on their western flank. And they're probably just going to continue pushing upwards until they kind of meet, on the southern part of Seversk here, and then maybe make this into a giant pocket or something. And, then kind of have the front line go something like this. Now, again, this does make it a bit of a salient a bit, but it has natural defenses with the rail lines and the rivers, and so it's a bit more defensible salient. Because once they reach here, the Russians will probably also try to, so the front line will probably go something like this. And then once this happens, the Russians will, well, I actually don't know. There's a lot of ways the Russians can move this. Maybe the Russians will try to outflank Verkhomanyanska, through the fields to the north here, and attack it from the back. Because right now the Russian attacks directly on it are repelled because they have a giant trench system that goes on. I think you could see it here. There's like a giant trench system that's in this area. I'm trying to find it. But yeah, there's a giant trench system that's in the in this Verkhomanyanska area, and and so if they want to capture this, they might want to attack from the back instead of directly, or they could attack to the west here and try to capture maybe Fedorovka, maybe capture a few of these fields, and these hills, maybe capture the hills here and capture this area right here, and start cutting off Seversk from the west. But before they could do any of that, they need to continue marching north along the rail line. So we talked about this last week, that the Russians have captured the village of Vimvka, and but some sources are saying that Ivano-Darivka has come back to the Ukrainians, because again, the Ukrainians have control of the hills to the north here, and so they're able to. Ivano-Darivka is on the lowland, so they're able to drive the Russians away from it. So the Russians will probably continue trying to battle for Ivano-Darivka just to kind of flatten the front line a little bit, but the Russians will have to basically deal with the hills right here to the south of Verkhomanyanska if they want to fully secure their gains in this area. So that might be where the Russians might go next. So yeah, the Russians are pushing in Seversk. In the Liman direction, the Russians are making small gains near Nevesky and Makeyevka here. The Russians made some small gains to the south here at Makeyevka. They managed to capture, I think it was this area of Nevesky, so they're trying to close the distance between Nevesky and the Russian positions in Luhansk. I guess this is part of Luhansk, but the Russians are trying to close on Nevesky as the Russians are fiercely battling for Makeyevka, because if Makeyevka falls, then the Russians will be able to start moving southwards, and they could put the squeeze on two ends, and they could kind of collapse all the Ukrainian defenses along the Zhirbets River here. So small gains in Makeyevka and towards Nevesky in the Liman direction. As we talked about last week, the Russians have fully secured themselves along the Shtomaknovka and Drivka area. It looks like they're probably going to pause here or build up their defenses here as the Russians improve their positions in the north here, and probably just kind of gear up and for an eventual attack towards Lazova. But these three villages have been taken by the Russians. We got geolocated footage of that, and I think the Russians are probably pausing here for the time being as the situations develop in the north here, which is where a lot of other gains are happening. The Russians have made more gains in Pashana. The Russians managed to capture this area right here, and then so they're advancing towards Koloshnovka here. This is what a lot of sources think. This is where the Russians want to push towards, and it's so like the Russians are so close. I have any time now, probably sometime in September, the Russians will try to do some sort of giant attack and try to reach the Oskol River and then split the area in two. So that is the goal. We'll see if the Russians are able to do that. I think the Russians also captured a little bit more to the south here. I think they captured this area here. And so I think the Russians will probably try to, kind of flatten the front line here to the south of Pashana and Berestova. And they have kind of flattened the front line here a little bit in the north, but I think it's about time that the Russians will probably try to do a direct assault on the Oskol River here. Also in the north here, the Russians have fully captured the village of Sinkovka. We talked about how the Russians entered the northern part of the village last week. We have basically mappers are saying that the Russians have completely captured this village. We also have some geolocated footage of the Russians have captured this forest right here, or at least maybe we know they're in control of this center part here. So the Russians have captured Sinkovka, which is a good move from them. Now this gives them a springboard towards the village of Petropavlovka, but I'm betting that the Russians won't continue pushing towards this area. I think the Russians will probably try to clear this forest. Maybe there's like these roads. Maybe they'll try to capture this area right here, reach the Oskol here, and try to clear maybe everything to the this area right here, and then from there, maybe the Russians will maybe advance further south here and try to reach this area and then reach the Oskol River here and then clear this forest right here. And probably simply try to secure the Sinkovka Liman Parashi forest to the north here because they need to secure this forest if they want to continue pushing in the northern direction of Kupiansk, just as the push from Pashana allows them to reach the southern part of Kupiansk. So they're kind of related here. But yeah, so let's continue in the Kharkov direction. Again, not very much gains here. We have the Ukrainians made some small gains in the northeastern direction of Lipsy, captured these trees right here. So just a small little map change here. I don't think there's been anything else happening in Kharkov. I think the Battle of Staritsia is still going on. I think the Russians are still in control of Staritsia, but the Ukrainians are trying to, there's been fierce clashes along the Staritsia borderlands here. And also in Volchansk itself, there's been really no changes. Yeah, Kharkov kind of got quiet after Kursk. Speaking of Kursk, there's been some, again, the offensive for the Ukrainians has slowed down, but there's been a lot of changes. Let's go around here. So I kind of call it, there's two sections of Kursk I'd like to talk about. I call it the Kornovo direction, which is if you split Kursk in half here, everything that's going on to the western side of Kursk and then the eastern side of Kursk. The western side I call the Kornovo direction, and this one I call the Sushka direction. So if you look at the western direction, this is where the Russians have made some gains this week. The Russians have basically recaptured Ologovka. They managed to push take more fields on the outskirts of the Kornovo here. They managed to clear out this area and managed to continue securing their stuff in the northern part of Kornovo. In the south here, the Ukrainians have not made any more gains. We talked about how the Ukrainians took Snagnosk and reached the river here, but besides that, they're still in the same positions they were last week, so they weren't able to continue developing in the southern direction. So the Russians made some small gains and stopped any Ukrainian gains in the Kornovo direction. However, when we look at this in the Sushka direction, this is where the Ukrainians have made more progress. Again, in the Kornovo direction, the goal is to encircle Kornovo and also push the Russians on the other side of the river Zem and take Luzhovka here, and then have the front line go something like this, and then have Kornova be the new supply base and such like that. However, in the Sushka direction, this is where the Ukrainians are making gains. Now, again, they're smaller gains. They're not as big as we saw in the first times of this offensive, but there are some gains nonetheless. It looks like in the more northern area of the Sushka direction, the Ukrainians have fully captured the village of Malonovka here. The Russians made a big defense of this women's prison right here, but it looks like they finally had to get fallen back, and it looks like the Ukrainians have taken a bunch of villages here. And this is kind of the more fog of war area, this area between kind of Suchka and Kornova, this area in the middle here. It's kind of hard to know where the Russians are. The Russians show themselves in this area right here, but we don't, and we saw the Russians battling here. But this entire area to the north here, we don't actually know the exact. This is why there's a big gray zone here. We don't know where the Russian positions are. We don't know where the Ukrainian positions are. We just, I would bet probably, though, that says the Russians are here. A lot of sources are also saying that there were some clashes in Nedovno here and Kamnashka. So it looks like, if I had to guess, that the Russian positions are something like this. And the Ukrainians managed to, after the fall of Malonovka, which was kind of served as a defense node here, the Ukrainians were able to push north and capture a string of these villages along this rail line and continue pushing north here. The Ukrainians will probably continue using the rail line as their area to advance, but again, if they continue advancing, though, they could make a salient, because right now, the front line is pretty uniform, but if they continue pushing this way, right, then there'll be this big salient here. So it looks like the Ukrainians did a good job improving themselves in the north here, but they need to continue improving, pushing towards the east, towards the west, so that they could continue pushing here. So I think the Ukrainians will probably pause in this direction and secure their gains in the Malonovka direction. The battles are right in the more southern direction here. The battles are still going on for Cherkasky Pornoska and Rusko Pornoska here. Looks like this is where the Russians showed that hey, we're fully secure of this area, but they didn't show themselves here or here. But we saw some geolocated footage of the Russians and Ukrainians battling each other in these two villages. So the front line kind of goes something like this. So this is what the two villages are being attacked over here, and the Russians are basically using these string of villages as probably the last line of defense before the main town of Bolshoi Soldovska here. So the Russians are trying, and what the Ukrainians are trying to do is basically flatten the front line here and have the front line go something like this. Speaking of that, as the Russian in the more towards Stuchka itself, the Ukrainians have completely captured the village of Mikhailovka and Martinovka here. These were after the fall of Stuchka. The Ukrainians are basically trying to push the Russians back and create a new defense line that could hold off the Russians from attacking Stuchka itself, which is one of the biggest gains of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. And so right now, a lot. They finally captured these two villages, and I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is probably try to take the village of Kuruluk, and if they could secure these two villages, then they could flatten the front line here, and then kind of create a new front line. And if they want to stop, then that could be a good position to hold. The Russians will be in this area here, and then with Bolshoi Soldovsky as their defense line, the Ukrainians will be here, and then using Sushka as their defenses. So they'll be kind of a string of villages will be the defense line, but then the supply logistics center will be in these two towns, which are a lot bigger. The Ukrainians are trying to improve themselves in the south here. I think they took the village of Cherkasky Konovka here, and probably just try to improve, because if they want to make this the front line, the Russians are still in the south here. They could attack. If you take Kurluvka here, right, then they could still attack you from the south here. So it looks like, the battles are still going on for Rushka Konovka here, and Cherkasky Konovka here. And so if the Ukrainians could secure themselves here, they'll probably try to take the village of Pushkinova here and try to basically have the front line go something like this. Just kind of, again, push the Russians away from the southern part of Suchka. So the Russians are foiling Ukrainian plans in the western side of Kursk. The Ukrainians are making small gains in the eastern side, but like anywhere else in the front, it is now kind of more slow gains. in this war. So but again, this is what we were expecting for the last 2 years or so. It's been small gains. We're kind of returning back to tradition here, but you know. So there, we saw a bunch of rapid collapses in the Pokrovsk direction. We got and we saw the big invasion in Kursk. So we saw a lot of big changes. But again, maybe we thought this would be a big change in the war, but it looks like things are going to go back to the way they were. So small gains throughout the rest of this for the foreseeable future. So yeah, so if you like this video, if you guys enjoyed my analysis and my overview of the events that happened this week, be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, and be sure to share this video around. So aim high and wander on.